They say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, good intentions play a key role in the Buddha's understanding of practice and in his understanding of ethical conduct. So how do we square these two things? I'll discuss that coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you'd like to have a deeper dive into some issues of early Buddhism, about the Buddha's life, about an introduction to the Buddha's teaching, check out my courses over on the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. So what I want to do here in this video is first to begin with a sort of an outline, a quick outline of the Buddha's view on the role of intentions in action, why they were so important. And then after that, we'll get to some questions that were put by Joel Fry, who commented on an earlier video of mine, and raised a number of different questions about this, which I think are important to go through. So to begin with, the Buddha very famously declared that when I say karma, I mean intention. That is to say that he pinpointed intention as the key player in karma, in karmic action, which is to say, in the ethical value of our action going forward. So it's the character of our intention that make an action either skillful or unskillful, make it ethical or unethical, make it good or bad, if you like. And in that, the Buddha was explicitly setting himself up as different from two of the major belief systems of his day, which were Jainism and Vedic Brahmanism. In Jainism, there is still the idea, that the ethical character of the action has relatively little to do with your intention. So it only has to do with whether you harm other people by your bodily movement, by your actions, if you like. So, for example, this is one of the reasons why Jains will sweep the ground in front of them when they walk, to avoid stepping inadvertently on small creatures. Or they will have a mask over their face to avoid inadvertently breathing in small creatures. Now, you might say that if they do these, they do them unintentionally, but for the Jain it doesn't matter. If you harm other beings, either intentionally or not, you are morally culpable for that action. And so you have to be very careful not to act, basically. And that, in the final analysis, is kind of one of the goals of Jain practice, is a practice of non-action so as not to harm other beings, even unintentionally. On another side, Vedic Brahmanism had a completely different view, but similar in that respect, which is that it wasn't your intentions that were important. For the Vedic Brahmin, what made something karmically active was that the right rituals were performed about it. So the Vedic Brahmin was the person who was in charge of doing certain kinds of rituals around the sacred fires, in particular rituals of burning and so on. And as long as the rituals were done properly, that is, done in the right way and with the right utterances around them, they had to be syllabically perfect, uttered perfectly correctly. If all of them were done properly according to the formula, then good karma would result. That is to say, you would get perhaps a benefit in this life, you would get more wealth, you would get a larger family, you would get health, let's say, a longer life, or you might get a better rebirth. But if you did not perform these things properly, then you would not get these benefits, and you might actually get bad things happen. But in either case, the intention didn't matter. It was not the intention that made any difference. It was the correct ritual performance that mattered. And the Buddha set himself up as quite different from both of these. What the Buddha said is that what really matters is the intention behind your action. Is it a pure intention or an impure intention? If it's a pure intention, then it's an intention, let's say, built around the intentions, let's say, the motivations of charity, of generosity, of kindness, of compassion, of wisdom. These would be pure intentions. Impure intentions, as I'm sure we'll be familiar with, are intentions of greed, of hatred, of ignorance. These are the kinds of intentions that are impure. And if our action is motivated by, let's say, hatred, then it is an impure act, and it is an act that will be of bad karma for us. Now, in the traditional understanding, there are some nuances here, in particular with actions that are performed completely ethically, because completely selfless actions, as they're understood to be actions of, let's say, awakened people, have no karma at all attached to them. So there's an idea that even good karma is not as good as having no karma at all with our actions, which is what happens if we perform them selflessly. But we can leave that that sort of side case aside for now. I mean, for this discussion, because it's not really relevant. So in any event, Joel Fry's question is this. He asks, so what if I do something with bad intention, but end up doing no harm? And what about the cliche, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? The Buddha said, your consequences follow from your actions, just as the wheel follows the ox. He didn't seem to be speaking of intentions, but of actions. Now, I'm not sure where Joel Fry got the quote that he cites there. It seems very similar to the first stanza of the Dhammapada, which is, of course, a very famous stanza. And that stanza, in fact, pretty clearly illustrates the kind of ethical background that I'm discussing here. So if we read, and this is a translation by Gil Fronsdale, the first paragraph, the first stanza of the Dhammapada, it says, all experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. So the basic upshot of this quote here, of this first stanza, is to say that if we speak or act with a corrupted mind, that is to say with bad intentions, suffering will surely follow. And then there's another one after that that says that we speak or act with good intentions, that good things will follow. So Joel's question basically is, well, what about situations in which you speak or act with bad intentions, but nobody's harmed? It seems like that's a contradiction here. It seems like that's a problem for the Buddha's theory. And I would say at first glance it is, but there's a deeper point being made here. The point there was a recent a blog post a while ago by the Buddhist scholar and meditation teacher Bodhipaksha, where he talks about this first stanza and relates it to another sutta in the early tradition, where the Buddha is talking about how to train the mind to think in better ways. This kind of thought that he had when he was before he was awakened, actually. And one of the points that the Buddha makes, the Buddha says, is that whatever one frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of one's mind. And this is a question of repetition, as indeed the ancient Greeks, as Aristotle made the famous point that oftentimes when we begin our path, acting ethically isn't so easy for us. And so we have to train ourselves by essentially doing ethical things, doing good things, thinking in good ways, in a kind of a rote fashion over and over again, sort of to train the mind. And as we train the mind to think in good ways, then we will get better over time. In the same way that if you train to memorize multiplication tables or something, you'll remember them more in the future. And the Buddha's point is the same. It is, okay, so if you do something intentional and do it with the wrong intention, let's say, maybe it doesn't hurt somebody right now, but the point is that if you practice that way over a period of time, by acting out of hatred, that you're only making things worse. You're making things worse for yourself. You're going to tend to act more out of hatred by reinforcing those tendencies within yourself. And as a result, it's going to end up in harm to somebody eventually. Because you're not practicing in the right way. You're practicing in a way that's leading you away from beneficial action and towards harmful action. But there's a deeper and I think more immediate point here, which is there's always going to be a question about whether or not you harm somebody else by acting out of greed or hatred or ignorance. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But in all of these cases, you're harming yourself. Because the states, these intentions themselves, intention of greed, the intention of hatred, in particular, intentions of delusion or ignorance, are states of suffering. They simply constitute states of suffering. They come out of suffering. And this is one of the benefits of doing deep meditation. Indeed, one of the insights, I think, that arises out of meditation, or may arise for you as it has arisen for me, is an immediate awareness of the suffering involved with greed, of the suffering involved with hatred. These are not pleasant states to be in. And so insofar as you are not only allowing them to arise and propagate within you, but reinforcing them over time, you are simply you're causing to occur suffering within yourself. And so the suffering that follows, like the wheel of the ox cart, or the hoof of the ox, I don't remember the exact point, but the suffering that follows immediately, partly because it's your own suffering that's following. Now, and Joel asks about this cliche that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Couple of points here. First of all, I think there are many ways we can interpret that cliche. The first, of course, is that many of us may intend to do good, but then never follow up on it. And so the intention alone is not sufficient. So if we have good intentions but just sit on them, they're not going to be very useful. They're not going to be very helpful to anybody. And of course, for the Buddha as well, that's the same, that you have to act on in good intentions, that simply having good intentions isn't enough. Good intentions are the start. In fact, it's the second part of the Eightfold Path is right intention. But you have to then act. You have to speak with good intentions as well. So they have to be carried forward. Now, another problem that the cliche brings up is, I think, again, a slightly deeper problem, which is that we may intend good, and yet our action may misfire. Now, this is a problem of the sort of the world getting in the way of our intentions. So our intentions may be pure, but there may be something that between our intentions and a successful outcome that doesn't work properly. And in general, these are not the kinds of issues that the Buddha talked about. I have an earlier video on moral dilemmas where I discuss a little bit of this issue. These kinds of dilemmas or misfires are things that we discuss a lot in sort of Western philosophy, but that were really not discussed very much in the Buddha's day anyhow. And so the Buddha doesn't really have a clear answer here, but I think there are a couple of different issues we might want to discuss. It may be in the first case that our intention is completely pure, but as I say, the world gets in the way, that something misfires. Let's say there's somebody who's hungry. We have a very pure intention to feed them, so we prepare food for them, we bring them food. But it happens that unbeknownst to us and unbeknownst to the person, and indeed perhaps unbeknownst to the wider society, the food that we give them is something they're allergic to. Perhaps nobody knows about this allergy. Perhaps it's unique to them. And so we end up doing them damage. And perhaps they end up getting sick. Perhaps even they end up dying. Now, in the Buddha's understanding, we are not morally culpable for that. We did not intend. Our intention was completely pure. And it's a simple fact that the world is not perfect. That, as the Buddha says, all things are dukkha. All things in this samsaric world are imperfect, are unsatisfactory in some sense, and so we can't ever count on perfect control over outcomes. And sometimes, despite our best intentions, the outcome doesn't succeed. And in that case, if our intention again was pure, we are not morally culpable. Now, there's another case, however, where moral culpability is, as I would say, a little bit more insecure. Where, let's say, we do something which is where we might want to say culpably ignorant. Let's say that a young child wants a present for their birthday, and somebody decides that it would be a good idea to give them a handgun, a loaded handgun for their birthday, because some young kids like guns. Something happens with the handgun, somebody's injured, maybe the boy or the girl injures themselves. In this situation, we might want to discuss moral culpability, because the person should have known better. And here we want to stress that while it's true that greed and hatred are sort of impure origins for our intentions or impure intentions, it's also true that ignorance is an impure intention, and that there may be a role for an ignorance about the way the world works being culpable. Certainly in, let's say, Aristotle's theory, and Aristotle wasn't the Buddha, but Aristotle had an idea of the way that we train our wisdom through acting in the world. And I think the Buddha would probably have agreed to this kind of thing as well. That if somebody thinks, as some people seem to, that handguns aren't dangerous, that somehow they're not, it's not handguns that injure people, it's people that injure people, and so therefore handguns aren't dangerous and aren't a problem, that's a culpably ignorant kind of view. And so, to that extent, some of our intentions may arise out of that kind of culpable ignorance into action, and may indeed result in bad karma, I would say, on the Buddha's view, or at least on moral culpability, because they did something that really they should have known would have been a problem. So, but the deeper question here, and one that tends to be asked in, let's say, Western philosophical circles when it comes to ethics, which is what we've been discussing really, is whether there's a way to sort of calculate all of this. And I think a lot of Western approaches to ethics try to think of ethics as kind of like a calculation system, a mathematics, sort of a system of reason, or a rational system where if you just have all of the ducks lined up in a row, you can make a calculation and decide whether something is ethical or unethical. And I don't think that at the end of the day, I don't think that's a possibility. I don't think we can ever do that, because there are just too many questions. There are too many open answers. There are too many things that we need to know about before we can answer a question like this. And again, when we come to the Buddha certainly was never interested in that kind of approach. The Buddha was interested more in psychology, in how to purify our minds, in how to make our minds better through a course of practice over time. And of course, a course of practice can't ever be perfect in the sense of viewing every outcome before we start. That's just not possible. We view the outcomes as we move, and we learn from them. And in general, the Buddha was not somebody who wanted to ground his ethics or any of his philosophy, indeed, on first principles, as they're called in the West, where again you have a small number of first principles of claims that you make, of ethical claims that are supposed to sort of ground everything else, and you can sort of calculate and derive everything from them. Not something the Buddha ever was interested in. And so while, for example, you can understand the Buddha as having said that ethics is sort of grounded upon our intentions, because as he says, when I say karma, I mean intention, there are also ways of understanding the Buddha's approach in other ways, as being an approach based on virtues, let's say. That it's a number of virtues that we have, and that's what's important to our ethics, is whether we have these virtues or whether we don't have the virtues. There are a number of different approaches in the early Buddhist system, and none of them should really be seen as exclusive. So if you find this video or these videos of mine useful, check out my Patreon page. You'll see it linked down below. Share it with other people and give it a thumbs up if you like it, and subscribe even. And I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. So meanwhile, all of you be well.